The first time I ran into Theo Nakamura, I literally ran into him. It was the kind of collision that happens in slow motion. Me rushing around the corner of the science building, late for AP Physics after staying too long in the darkroom developing photos, and him walking backward while talking to someone, his attention anywhere but on the path ahead. My stack of photography portfolios went flying. His open water bottle emptied itself across both our shirts. And suddenly I was staring into the darkest eyes I'd ever seen, set in a face that made my breath catch. "I am so sorry," we both said at the exact same time. For a moment, we just stared at each other and I felt a strange flutter in my chest. Like something significant had just happened, though I couldn't have explained why. Then reality crashed back in. I was soaked. My carefully curated photography portfolio was scattered across the concrete walkway. And I was now officially late for Mrs. Chen's class, which meant automatic detention. "My portfolio," I gasped, dropping to my knees to gather the black and white prints before they could be trampled by passing students. He knelt beside me immediately, water dripping from his navy blue t-shirt as he quickly gathered photos with surprising care, making sure not to touch the surfaces with his fingertips. "These are incredible," he said, his voice low and warm as he paused to look at one of my favorite shots, a candid of an elderly couple feeding pigeons in the park, their weathered hands almost touching as they scattered breadcrumbs. "Thanks," I mumbled, both pleased and embarrassed by his attention. "You took these." He continued collecting the photos, but his eyes kept returning to them with genuine interest. "Yeah, they're for my AP photography submission." He handed me the stack he'd gathered, our fingers brushing slightly in the exchange. "I'm Theo, and I really am sorry about crashing into you." "Iris," I replied, "Iris Chin, and it was probably my fault. I wasn't looking where I was going." A small smile curved his lips. "Let's call it mutual catastrophe then." The warning bell rang, making me wince. "I have to go. I'm already late for physics." "With Mrs. Chin?" he asked, standing and offering me a hand up. I nodded, accepting his help and trying to ignore the way my skin tingled where he touched it. "Me too," he said. "New transfer. Today's my first day and I'm already making a stellar impression." He glanced down at his wet shirt ruefully. Great. Not only had I made myself late, but I'd also drenched the new kid on his first day. But as we both stood there, dripping and disheveled, he laughed, a warm, genuine sound that somehow made everything less catastrophic. "Come on," he said, gesturing toward the building. "Maybe she'll go easier on us if we face the firing squad together." He didn't, of course. Mrs. Chin, no relation to me, despite sharing a last name, was notorious for her strict policies. We both got detention slips before she allowed us to take our seats. The only available desk was directly behind mine, so for the rest of the period, I felt Theo's presence like a warm current at my back. Occasionally I'd hear the scratch of his pen or a soft exhale as he worked through a difficult problem. Once when I dropped my calculator and it skittered backward, his hand appeared in my peripheral vision, returning it with a small note stuck to the back. "Worth it. Your photos are amazing." I felt my cheeks heat as I quickly tucked the note into my textbook before Mrs. Chin could spot it. When the bell rang at the end of class, I half expected Theo to disappear into the crowd of students rushing for the door. Instead, he waited as I gathered my things. "So," he said as we walked into the hallway, "detention together at 4? "Looks that way," I replied, oddly not as upset about it as I should have been. "Perfect," he said with that same easy smile. "It'll give me a chance to hear about the photographer behind those incredible images." As he headed off to his next class with a casual wave, I stood frozen in the middle of the hallway, my heart beating a strange, syncopated rhythm. I just met Theo Nakamura, and somehow I knew my senior year had irrevocably changed course. What I didn't know then was just how much. Windhill Heights wasn't the kind of high school you see in movies, neither a gleaming palace of opportunity nor a crumbling inner-city stereotype. It was solidly middle class, serving our suburban community with decent resources and the usual high school hierarchies. I'd spent 3 years carefully constructing my place within those hierarchies. Photographer for the school newspaper, solid B+ student, not popular enough to be invited to every party but well-liked enough to avoid being actively excluded. I had my small circle of friends, my college applications nearly complete, and a plan for the remaining months until graduation. Theo Nakamura was not part of that plan. After our collision, I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just an awkward encounter with a new kid who would soon find his own social circle and fade into the background of my senior year. But detention that afternoon proved me wrong. I arrived to find him already there, sitting at a desk by the window where late afternoon sunlight caught in his dark hair, giving it hints of deep blue. He was sketching something in a notebook, his focus absolute until I walked in. Then he looked up and his whole face brightened. "Detention, buddy," he said, gesturing to the desk beside him. Mr. Grayson, the English teacher stuck with detention duty, barely glanced up from his novel. "No talking," he reminded us automatically. I slid into the indicated desk, pulling out my calculus homework. For 20 minutes we worked in silence, but I could feel Theo's presence beside me like a magnetic field. Occasionally our elbows would almost touch as we wrote, and each near miss sent a ridiculous tingle up my arm. When Mr. Grayson stepped out to use the restroom, Theo immediately turned to me. "So what's the verdict? Is Windhill Heights everything a new senior could hope for?" he whispered. I couldn't help smiling at his dramatic tone. "Depends what you're hoping for. Decent people. Teachers who don't make me want to jump out windows. Maybe a darkroom I could borrow sometimes." That caught my attention. "You're into photography?" He shook his head. "Drawing and painting mostly. But I've been wanting to learn photography. Your work is the kind of thing I'd love to create." The compliment felt different from the casual, nice pics I usually got when people saw my photos. Theo spoke as if he'd actually seen what I was trying to capture, not just the surface image. "The darkroom's usually empty after school on Thursdays," I found myself saying. "I could show you the basics if you want." His face lit up. "Really? That would be amazing." Mr. Grayson returned then, cutting our conversation short. But two things had fundamentally changed. I'd made a commitment to see Theo again, and worse, I was looking forward to it. The next 2 days passed in a blur of unexpected moments. Theo and I shared 3 classes I discovered, and each time he sought me out, sitting nearby if possible, catching my eye across the room if not. At lunch on Wednesday, he appeared at my usual table with his tray, asking if the seat next to me was taken with such casual confidence that my friends immediately made space, curious about the new kid who'd somehow breached our established circle. By Thursday afternoon, when I met him outside the darkroom, it felt like I'd known him much longer than 3 days. "Photography 101, I said, unlocking the door with the key Ms. Abernathy had entrusted to me as her teaching assistant. "Are you ready to have your mind blown by the magic of chemical development?" He grinned, following me into the small, dimly lit space. "Absolutely." The darkroom was barely large enough for 2 people, with counters along 3 walls, enlargers at regular intervals, and trays of chemicals carefully arranged. It smelled of developer and stop bath, a scent I'd come to associate with creativity and calm. "First rule," I said, closing the door behind us, "is that once we switch to the safe light, no white light is allowed. It'll ruin any undeveloped paper or film." I flicked a switch and the regular lights went out, replaced by the amber glow of the safe light. The space immediately felt more intimate, the soft glow casting shadows across Theo's features, accentuating his cheekbones and the curve of his lips. "It's like another world in here," he said softly, looking around with genuine wonder. "That's why I love it," I admitted. "Time works differently in the darkroom. Everything slows down." For the next hour I showed him the basics, how to use the enlarger, how to expose the paper, the sequence of chemical baths that turned blank paper into an image. He was an attentive student, asking thoughtful questions and following my instructions carefully. When it came time for him to try developing a print himself, I handed him one of my negatives, a shot of the lake near my house at dawn, mist rising from the surface as the first light touched it. "This is one of yours?" he asked, handling the negative strip with careful fingers. I nodded. "From last summer." He positioned it in the enlarger with the same focus he'd shown when sketching, making minute adjustments until he was satisfied. I stood beside him, our shoulders almost touching in the confined space, and guided his hand to the timer. 10 seconds for this one," I said. "Then you'll see if all that careful positioning paid off." His hand was warm under mine, and I became acutely aware of how close we were standing, how the amber light softened everything, how his breathing had synchronized with mine. When I stepped back, the absence of his warmth was almost tangible. Theo exposed the paper, then transferred it carefully to the developer tray, gently rocking it as I'd shown him. We both watched in silence as the image began to appear, first the brightest parts, then gradually the shadows and details emerging from the blank whiteness. "It's magic," he whispered, his expression one of pure wonder. "Actual magic." I smiled, caught between watching the emerging image and watching his face. That's how it felt the first time I saw it happen. Like alchemy. When the print was fully developed, fixed and washed, Theo held it up to examine it in the dim light. "It's beautiful," he said. "The way you captured that moment, it feels like being there." Something about the genuine appreciation in his voice made me bold. "What about your art? Do you have any with you?" He hesitated, then reached for his backpack, pulling out a sketchbook. "It's nothing special, just stuff I'm working on." I took the book carefully, aware of the trust inherent in sharing creative work. As I opened it, I felt my breath catch. Page after page of intricate drawings, some realistic portraits and landscapes, others abstract compositions that somehow conveyed powerful emotions through line and form. "Theo, these are incredible," I said, turning the pages slowly. "You're seriously talented." He shrugged, but I could see the pleasure my words gave him. "I've been drawing since I could hold a pencil. My mom's an artist, so I guess it's in the blood." I paused on a drawing that particularly caught my eye. A girl sitting on a windowsill, her back to the viewer, looking out at a sky filled with stars. Something about the solitude of the figure, contrasted with the vastness of the night sky, resonated deeply with me. "This one," I said softly. "It's perfect." He moved closer, looking over my shoulder at the drawing. "That's my sister May. She's obsessed with astronomy, wants to be an astrophysicist. You captured something really special, I told him. The perspective makes me feel like I'm in the room with her, but also aware of how small we all are under those stars. Theo was quiet for a moment, just standing close beside me in the amber light. That's exactly what I was trying to show, he finally said, his voice soft with surprise. No one's ever seen that before. Our eyes met in the dim light and something shifted between us. A recognition, a connection that went beyond our shared interest in art. For a heartbeat, I thought he might lean closer, and I wasn't sure if I wanted him to or was terrified that he would. The moment broke when the darkroom door opened, flooding the space with light from the hallway. Oops, sorry. It was Ms. Abernathy, quickly closing the door to preserve any undeveloped materials. Just checking if anyone was still in here. Didn't mean to interrupt your work. It's okay, I called back, my voice embarrassingly unsteady. We were just finishing up. When she was gone, Theo and I looked at each other, then both laughed nervously. I should probably get home, he said, gathering his things. But this was really great, Iris. Thank you. As we turned the regular lights back on and cleaned up the darkroom, the strange intimacy of the moment lingered. Walking out into the late afternoon sunshine felt like emerging from a dream into reality. Maybe we could do this again sometime? Theo asked as we reached the student parking lot. I could show you some painting techniques in exchange for more photography lessons. I'd like that, I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. He smiled, the kind of smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes and made something flutter in my chest. It's a date then. He said it casually, just a figure of speech. But the word, date, echoed in my mind long after he'd waved goodbye and headed for his car. I sat in my own car for several minutes before starting the engine, trying to understand what was happening. I'd known Theo Nakamura for exactly 3 days, and somehow he'd already burrowed under my carefully constructed defenses, making me feel things I hadn't planned for in my orderly senior year. The rational part of me said to back away now before things got complicated, but as I drove home with the windows down and music playing, all I could think about was the way the amber light had softened his features and how perfectly he'd understood what I was trying to capture in my photography. I was in trouble and I knew it, but for the first time in a long time, trouble felt an awful lot like possibility. The problem with Theo wasn't just that he was new or talented, or had a smile that made my stomach do gymnastic routines. The problem was that he didn't fit into any of the categories I understood. My last relationship had been with Daniel Kim during junior year. A sensible 3 months of movie dates and study sessions that ended amicably, when we both realized we worked better as lab partners than as a couple. Before that, a brief sophomore year crush on Lilia Body had fizzled out before anything really happened. Both experiences had been pleasant enough but lacking any real emotional intensity. Whatever was happening with Theo felt different, less like the steady progression of getting to know someone and more like suddenly finding myself in free fall, uncertain where or how I would land. Earth to Iris, Priya Singh, my best friend since 7th grade, waved her hand in front of my face. You've been staring at your sandwich for 5 minutes without taking a bite. What's going on with you? We were sitting at our usual lunch table in the corner of the cafeteria, the spot we'd claimed as our territory since freshman year. Close enough to see everything happening in the social ecosystem of Windhill Heights, but far enough from the center to avoid unwanted attention. Nothing, I said automatically, then sighed at Priya's skeptical look. Okay, not nothing, just thinking. About the new guy? Priya's dark eyes sparkled with amusement. The one who's been looking for you since he walked into the cafeteria? I refused to turn around, but I could feel a blush creeping up my neck. We're just friends, Mum. Priya took a deliberate bite of her apple, her expression making it clear she didn't believe me for a second. That's why you've been drawing stars in your notebook all through English. I glanced down at my notebook, embarrassed to realize she was right. The margins were filled with tiny constellations, unconsciously mimicking the drawing of Theo's sister looking at the night sky. It's not like that, I insisted, closing the notebook. He's interested in photography. I'm showing him some techniques. That's all. If you say so. Priya shrugged. But just so you know, he's coming this way and you might want to stop blushing before he gets here. Before I could respond, Theo appeared at our table, lunch tray in hand. Is it okay if I join you guys? He asked, his eyes finding mine with that direct gaze that always made me feel like I was the only person in the room. Actually, Priya said, gathering her things with suspicious speed, I was just leaving. I need to talk to Mr. Reed about the English assignment before next period. She shot me a meaningful look as she stood up. See you in history, Iris. And then she was gone, leaving me alone with Theo and my half-eaten sandwich. Your friend doesn't like me? Theo asked, sitting down in Priya's vacated spot. The opposite, I admitted. She's trying to give us space because she thinks, well, she has the wrong idea about us. What idea is that? His tone was casual, but his eyes were intent on mine. I fumbled for words, suddenly feeling like I was navigating a minefield. Just that that there's something happening between us. Theo was quiet for a moment, picking at his lunch without looking at it. And there isn't? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with potential meanings. My heart was racing and I couldn't seem to form a coherent thought. I mean, we're friends, I finally said. We just met a week ago. He nodded slowly. Right, friends. Then he smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. So, friends often go to football games together, right? There's one tonight. The abrupt change of subject caught me off guard. You want to go to the football game? Together. As friends, he clarified, his tone light but his eyes still holding that intensity. Unless you already have plans? I didn't have plans. Friday nights were usually spent either working on photography projects or watching movies with Priya. But something about the way Theo was looking at me, hopeful yet guarded, made me hesitate. Being around him was already confusing enough. Spending a Friday night together, even in the crowded anonymity of the football stands, felt like crossing a line I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. I should probably check with Priya, I hedged. We sometimes have standing plans on Fridays. Of course, he said immediately, leaning back slightly. No pressure. Just thought it might be fun. I felt an immediate pang of regret at his withdrawal. But I'd like to, I added quickly. Go to the game, with you. As friends. His smile turned genuine again, lighting up his whole face. Great. I can pick you up at 6? The game starts at 7, but I heard there's usually a tailgate thing beforehand. 6 works, I said, wondering what I was getting myself into. The rest of lunch passed in easier conversation about classes and his adjustment to Windhill Heights. But underneath it all, I felt a current of anticipation and anxiety that had nothing to do with football. When I met Priya in history class, she took one look at my face and said, "Oh my God, you have a date with him." "It's not a date," I insisted. "We're going to the football game. As friends." That's what he said. Priya rolled her eyes. "Iris, I love you, but you're the most oblivious person I know when it comes to guys who like you. He's totally into you." "Even if he is," I whispered as our teacher began taking attendance, "I'm not looking for a relationship right now. I have college applications, portfolio submissions, the newspaper." "Excuses," Priya whispered back. "You're scared because he makes you feel something real." I didn't have a response to that, partly because Miss Thomas was glaring in our direction, but mostly because I was afraid Priya might be right. When 6 o'clock rolled around, I was standing in front of my closet having a minor crisis. What did one wear to a not date at a football game with a maybe friend who might possibly want to be more than friends? I finally settled on jeans, my favorite blue sweater that my mom always said brought out my eyes, and a light jacket in case it got cool. Casual but put together. Nothing that screamed I spent an hour choosing this outfit. Theo arrived exactly on time, knocking on the front door rather than texting from the driveway like most of my friends would have done. My dad answered before I could get there, and I arrived in the entryway to find them already talking about my dad's vintage car restoration project. "Iris," my dad said, turning to me with a smile that contained equal parts amusement and parental assessment. "Your friend Theo was just telling me he helps his uncle restore classic motorcycles. Is that so?" I said, catching Theo's eye with a small smile. He'd never mentioned motorcycles to me. Theo shrugged modestly. "Just basic maintenance stuff. Your dad's Mustang sounds like a much bigger project." I could see my dad practically glowing at the interest. If there was one way to get his approval, it was genuine enthusiasm about his beloved car projects. "You kids have fun at the game," he said, giving me a look that I knew meant we'd be having a conversation later. "Nice to meet you, Theo." "You too, sir," Theo replied with perfect politeness. As we walked to his car, a slightly beat-up Honda Civic that had clearly seen better days, I bumped his shoulder lightly with mine. "Motorcycles, huh? You're full of surprises." He grinned, opening the passenger door for me. I contain multitudes. The drive to school was filled with easy conversation and music from a playlist that somehow perfectly blended songs I loved with ones I'd never heard but immediately liked. By the time we reached the school parking lot, any awkwardness I'd felt earlier had melted away. The football stadium was already filling with students and parents, the autumn air carrying the scents of popcorn and hot chocolate. We found seats halfway up the bleachers, close enough to see the action but far enough from the rowdier sections to be able to talk. "I should warn you," I said as we settled in, "I know practically nothing about football." Theo laughed. "That makes 2 of us. I was more of a soccer player at my old school." "You play soccer?" I asked, realizing how little I actually knew about him. "Used to. Probably won't join the team here since it's already mid-season, but I miss it." There was something wistful in his voice that made me curious. "Why did you move here anyway?" He never said. His expression shifted slightly, a shadow passing over his features. "My dad's job. He's in tech and there was an opportunity here they couldn't pass up." Something in his tone suggested there was more to the story, but before I could ask, the crowd roared as our team took the field. The marching band struck up the school fight song, and the cheerleaders began their routine. Found myself watching Theo more. Then the gamma leaned forward during plays, his genuine, Excitement wannered him scored. The inimitable way head with his hands when explaining what little he knew about football tactics. During the third quarter, the temperature dropped and I shivered slightly despite my jacket. Without a word, Theo shrugged off his own jacket, a well-worn denim with what looked like hand-painted designs on the back, and draped it over my shoulders. I run hot, he said when I protested. Seriously, I'm more comfortable like this. The jacket was still warm from his body, and it smelled like him, a mixture of clean laundry, art supplies, and something uniquely Theo that I couldn't identify but found instantly comforting. Thanks, I said softly, pulling it closer around me. Our eyes met, and for a moment the roaring crowd and the game below faded away. There was just Theo, his dark eyes reflecting the stadium lights, his face so close to mine that I could see the faint scar above his left eyebrow that I'd never noticed before. Then someone behind us spilled their soda, the cold liquid splashing against our shoes, and the moment shattered. The rest of the game passed in a blur. Our team won, which meant everyone was in high spirits as we made our way back to the parking lot. Theo's hand found mine in the crowd, ostensibly to keep us from getting separated, but he didn't let go even when we reached clearer areas. His hand was warm against mine, fingers intertwined with a gentle pressure that felt both casual and significant. I knew I should probably pull away, reinforce the just friends boundary, but I didn't want to. In his car, with the heater blowing and a quieter playlist filling the silence, Theo turned to me before starting the engine. I had a really good time tonight. Me too, I admitted. Even if I still don't understand why everyone got so excited about that last down thing. He laughed. I think it was a touchdown, but honestly I was too busy watching you to pay much attention to the game. The confession hung in the air between us, too direct to ignore. I looked down at my hands, not sure how to respond. Iris, he said softly, waiting until I looked up at him. I know you said we're just friends, and if that's what you want, I respect that. But I like you. A lot. And I think I hope you might feel something too. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I trailed off, not knowing how to express the jumble of feelings inside me. I do feel something, but it's complicated. He nodded, his expression serious but not discouraged. Complicated is okay. I'm not asking for anything specific. With honesty about where we stand. I took a deep breath. I like being around you, more than I expected to. But I've had this plan for senior year, focus on my portfolio, get into a good photography program, no distractions. And you're definitely, I gestured vaguely at him, a distraction. His mouth quirked up at one corner. I'll take that as a compliment. You should, I said, finding myself smiling despite the tension. But I'm just not sure I'm ready for whatever this might be. Theo was quiet for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. How about this? We keep hanging out, no pressure, no labels. Just see where things go naturally. And if at any point you decide you want to strictly be friends, you tell me and I'll respect that. The offer was reasonable, mature even. But something in me recognized that agreeing would be a kind of surrender to the pull I felt toward him, an admission that whatever was happening between us deserved space to develop. Okay, I said finally. No pressure, no labels. But honestly with each other about how we're feeling. Deal, he said, his smile returning full force. As he drove me home, his jacket still around my shoulders and music playing softly in the background, I felt like I was standing on a fault line, aware that the ground could shift beneath me at any moment, but somehow not afraid of the earthquake that might follow. October in New England means one day of tank top weather followed immediately by parka season, with maybe 3 perfect sweater days in between if you're lucky. The Monday after the football game brought the first real cold snap of the season, sending students scurrying between buildings with hunched shoulders and reddened noses. I was at my locker, exchanging my morning textbooks for afternoon ones, when a now familiar voice spoke behind me. I hear Lookout Point is amazing this time of year. All the leaves changing color along the river valley. I turned to find Theo leaning against the neighboring locker, looking unfairly good in a dark green sweater that made his eyes seem even darker by contrast. It is pretty spectacular, I agreed, trying to ignore the little flip my stomach did at the sight of him. Best view in town, especially at sunset. The weekend had passed without contact between us, and I'd spent an embarrassing amount of time checking my phone for texts that never came. I'd finally convinced myself he was giving me space to process our conversation after the game, but a small, insecure part of me had wondered if he'd changed his mind about the whole no pressure, no labels arrangement. His appearance at my locker clearly deliberate, since his own was in a different hallway, put those fears to rest. So, he continued, I was thinking it might make a great subject for photographs. And sketches. He held up his sketchbook meaningfully. Maybe this afternoon, if you're free. Are you asking me to take you to Lookout Point? I teased, unable to resist. That's a pretty classic move, Nakamura. He grinned, not at all embarrassed. For purely artistic purposes, I assure you. Though I won't object if you happen to find the setting romantically inspiring. I laughed despite myself. Subtle. Not really trying to be, he admitted. So, artistic expedition to Lookout Point? I should have said no. I had newspaper layouts to finalize and a calculus problem set due Wednesday. But the hopeful look in his eyes and my own curiosity about where this undefined thing between us might lead made the decision for me. Meet me in the parking lot after last period, I said, and bring your own hot chocolate. The little store up there charges tourist prices. His smile was worth every homework assignment I'd have to rush through later. Lookout Point was technically a small state park about 15 minutes from town, perched on a hillside overlooking the river valley. In summer it was popular with hikers and picnickers. In autumn, it became a destination for leaf peepers and photographers trying to capture the spectacular display of reds, oranges, and golds that blanketed the landscape. When we arrived, the small parking lot was nearly empty, a benefit of coming on a Monday afternoon when most people were still at work or school. "Wow," Theo said as we got out of his car, his breath visible in the crisp air. "You didn't exaggerate. The view was indeed breathtaking." The late afternoon sun slanted across the valley, illuminating the patchwork of fall colors spreading as far as the eye could see. The river cut through it all like a silver ribbon, reflecting the blue of the sky and the fire of the trees. I pulled my camera from my bag, already framing shots in my mind. "There's a trail that leads to an even better vantage point about 10 minutes up. Worth the hike if you're up for it. Lead the way," he said, sketchbook tucked under his arm and thermos in hand. We climbed in comfortable silence. The only sounds our footsteps on the leaf-strewn path and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. The physical exertion and the beauty surrounding us created a bubble of peace that made the usual high school dramas seem very far away. The trail opened onto a small clearing with a wooden bench overlooking a sheer drop to the valley below. The panoramic view was even more stunning than from the parking lot, offering a complete 180-degree vista of the autumn landscape. "This is incredible," Theo said softly, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the perfect scene before us. I was already raising my camera, capturing the sweep of the valley, the interplay of light and shadow, the gradations of color that no painter could fully reproduce. Photography was my way of holding on to moments that would otherwise slip away, preserving not just images but feelings, impressions, the essence of experiencing something beautiful or significant. Theo settled on the bench, opening his sketchbook and beginning to work with quick, confident strokes. We fell into creative synchronicity, each absorbed in our own medium but sharing the same inspiration. After about 20 minutes, I lowered my camera and joined him on the bench, curious to see his interpretation of the landscape. His drawing captured not just the visual elements but samihouth, moodoft ha place the expansiveness, theflating perfectiono photum, pitspeak theslight melancholy, of beludes and fade. "That's amazing," I said honestly. "You've got this way of making the scene feel alive on the page." He smiled, pleased by the compliment. "Your turn. Show me what you've captured." I scrolled through the images on my camera's display, explaining my choices of composition and focus. Theo listened intently, asking thoughtful questions about my process and what I was trying to convey in each shot. "You see things differently," he observed. "You found all these small, perfect moments within the bigger scene. The reflection of that single red maple in the river bend, the hawk silhouetted against the sky, the pattern of shadows on the hillside. Isn't that what art is?" I asked, finding the significant details that most people miss. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret, something between surprise and recognition. "Yeah, exactly that." We sat in silence for a moment, the connection between us feeling almost tangible in the clear autumn air. Then Theo pulled out his thermos and 2 paper cups. "Hot chocolate as requested," he said, pouring steaming liquid that smelled rich and homemade, not like the powdered stuff I'd expected. "Did you make this?" I asked, wrapping my cold fingers around the warm cup. He nodded. "My mom's recipe. Mexican hot chocolate with a little cinnamon and cayenne." The first sip was a revelation, sweet but complex, with a warmth that spread through my chest and a subtle spicy kick at the end. "This is incredible," I said, taking another sip. "Way better than anything I've ever had." Theo looked pleased. "Family recipe. My grandmother taught my mom, who taught me. Food's kind of our love language." "You cook too?" I asked, realizing yet again how little I knew about him. He shrugged, a gesture I was beginning to recognize as his way of downplaying things he was actually proud of. "Nothing fancy, just comfort food mostly. My dad works late a lot, so I started helping with dinner when I was pretty young." The casual revelation added another layer to my understanding of him. Theo the artist, Theo the soccer player, and now Theo the family cook. Each new fact made him more real, more complex, and infinitely more interesting. "Weset side by side on the bench, sipping hot chocolate the sun. Begin its final descent worth. Horizon painting theskin. Strokes off pink on gold hatno. Camera sketchbook hudfully. Capture." "Can I ask you something?" Theo said after a comfortable silence. "Sure. What are you most afraid of?" "About us, I mean." The directness of the question caught me off guard. In my previous relationships, if you could even call them that, we'd never talked about fears or feelings with such honesty. Everything had been kept surface level, safe. I looked out at the valley below, gathering my thoughts. "I guess that it would become too important, that I'd get distracted from all the things I've been working toward. College and your photography career?" I nodded. "But it's more than that. I've always had this clear image of who I am and where I'm going. Meeting you, it's like suddenly there's this whole other possibility I never planned for. And that's scary." Theo considered this, his expression thoughtful. "Can I tell you what I'm afraid of?" I turned to look at him, surprised he had fears of his own about this. "Of course. I'm afraid you'll never let yourself find out what this could be," he said quietly. "That you'll keep me at arm's length because it's safer than taking a chance." His honesty left me speechless. No one had ever called me out so directly on my tendency to choose safety over risk, especially in relationships. I'm not asking you to change your plans or your goals, he continued when I didn't respond. Those are part of who you are, and who you are is pretty amazing. I'm just asking for a chance to be part of the journey, not an obstacle to it. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the clearing and turning Theo's face golden in the fading light. In that moment, with the world spread out below us and the sky changing colors above, the carefully constructed boundaries I'd built around my heart felt suddenly flimsy and unnecessary. I set down my cup and reached for his hand, intertwining our fingers like we had after the football game. I'm trying, I said softly. This right now is me trying. Theo's smile was slow and warm, spreading across his face like sunrise. He squeezed my hand gently, his thumb tracing small circles on my skin. That's all I'm asking for, he said. We stayed that way as the sun sank below the horizon, the temperature dropping noticeably with its departure. Eventually, reluctantly, we packed up our things and headed back down the trail, using our phone flashlights to navigate the darkening path. In the car, with the heater blowing and the real world waiting just a short drive away, Theo turned to me before starting the engine. Thank you for bringing me here, he said, for sharing this place with me. Thank you for the hot chocolate, I replied, and for pushing me out of my comfort zone. He smiled, and for a moment I thought he might lean over and kiss me. Part of me, a surprisingly large part, hoped he would. Instead, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering briefly against my cheek. One step at a time, he said softly, as if reading my thoughts. No pressure, remember? As we drove back toward town, the comfortable silence between us felt like a new beginning, undefined, unplanned, but full of possibility.